The day of my father's funeral was cold, gray, and suffocating in a way that had nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with the people standing around pretending to grieve. I sat in the front row of the church, staring at the casket, my mind numb, my hands clenched into fists in my lap, trying to process the fact that the one person who had been my rock, my protector, my last real family, was gone forever. People came up to me with their hollow condolences, their sympathetic looks, their empty words about how he was in a better place now. But all I could think about was how wrong it felt, how unnatural, how unfair it was that a man who had worked his whole life to build something for his family had been taken so soon. But even through my grief, even through the heavy fog of loss pressing down on me, I couldn't ignore the way Linda, my father's second wife, was acting, the way she moved through the room with an energy that didn't fit the occasion, the way she kept glancing around as if she was sizing things up, the way she whispered to her daughter Rachel with a look of smug satisfaction instead of sorrow. It didn't take long for me to realize that, while I was mourning the loss of my father, they were already thinking about what came next. About what they could take, about what they could claim, about how they could make sure I was pushed aside as quickly as possible. I had never been close with Linda, never trusted her, never believed that she had married my father for anything other than the security he provided. She had always been polite enough to me, always put on the act of a caring stepmother when he was around, always played the role of a loving wife in public, but I had seen the way she looked at him when he wasn't paying attention, the way she rolled her eyes when he talked about his plans for the future, the way she had slowly but surely tried to insert herself into every aspect of his life, always making sure that her needs, her opinions, her wants came first. And Rachel, her daughter, was just as bad. Entitled, spoiled, always acting like she was owed something, always treating my father like he was nothing more than a walking bank account meant to fund her endless shopping sprees and expensive tastes. As the service ended and people started filing out, I stayed behind for a moment, letting the reality of it all sink in, letting myself have just a few minutes alone with the last piece of my father I had left. But before I could even gather my thoughts, Linda was suddenly there beside me, her perfectly manicured hand resting lightly on my shoulder. Her voice soft and fake in a way that made my skin crawl. "Eric, sweetheart," she said, tilting her head in that way she always did when she wanted to seem sympathetic but was really just setting the stage for whatever manipulation she had planned next. "I know this is such a difficult time for you, for all of us really. But I just wanted to talk to you about something important. You know, about the house and, well, what comes next." I turned to look at her, barely able to keep the disbelief off my face, my grief momentarily overshadowed by sheer incredulity. My father hadn't even been in the ground for a full day, and she was already bringing up the house, already thinking.
Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
Thinking about what she could take, already preparing to shove me out of the only home I had ever known. "What comes next?" I repeated, my voice quiet, controlled, but edged with something sharp, something dangerous, something that should have warned her not to push me right now. Linda let out a little sigh, squeezing my shoulder as if she was comforting me, as if she wasn't about to say something that would make my blood boil. "Well, sweetheart," she continued, her tone syrupy sweet, "you know how much your father loved me and Rachel, how much he wanted to make sure we were taken care of. And with everything changing now, we just need to start thinking about how to move forward, how to adjust things so that we can all be comfortable." I pulled away from her touch, my jaw tightening, my hands curling into fists at my sides as I took a slow, measured breath, trying to keep my temper in check, trying not to explode at a funeral. "What exactly are you saying, Linda?" I asked, my voice still calm but barely. Before she could answer, Rachel sauntered up beside her, looking as smug as ever, her arms crossed over her chest, her expensive black dress perfectly fitted, her expression so infuriatingly self-satisfied that I could already feel my patience slipping. "She's saying," Rachel interjected, flipping her hair over one shoulder, "that it doesn't really make sense for you to keep living in our house now that Dad's gone." I blinked. I actually had to take a second to process what she had just said, to make sure I had heard her correctly, to wrap my mind around the sheer audacity, the absolute nerve of this girl who had never lifted a damn finger for anything in her entire life. "Your house," I repeated slowly, my voice dangerously low now, my entire body going rigid as I fought the urge to say something that would turn this funeral into a full-blown war. Rachel shrugged, completely unfazed by the obvious fury building in me, as if she had already decided that my reaction didn't matter, as if she had already convinced herself that this conversation was just a formality, that my compliance was inevitable. "Well, yeah," she said, giving me a look like I was an idiot for even questioning it. "I mean, technically, Mom's the surviving spouse and I'm her daughter, so it just makes sense for us to take over the house now. I mean, no offense, but you're not exactly part of our family, you know." I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, feel my nails digging into my palms, feel the sheer, unchecked rage bubbling up inside me at the absolute gall of these two women standing in front of me, acting like I was some kind of guest in the home my father had built, like I was an inconvenience, like I was something that needed to be removed. I took a step closer, lowering my voice, making sure that when I spoke next, there was no room for misinterpretation, no room for them to think, even for a second, that I was going to roll over and let them take anything from me. "This is my house," I said slowly, deliberately, making sure each word hit like a hammer. "My father built it, my name is on the deed. And if you think for even a second that I'm going to pack up and walk away just because you want me to, you're out of your damn mind." Rachel's smirk faltered slightly, but Linda, ever the manipulator, simply sighed, shaking her head as if I was being unreasonable, as if I was the one causing a problem here. "Eric, sweetheart," she said again, her tone full of forced patience. "I think you should take some time to process everything. And while you do, maybe start looking for a new place, just so we can all move forward peacefully." I stared at them both, exhaling slowly, forcing myself to stay calm, forcing myself to remember that this wasn't over, that they weren't going to get away with this, that I wasn't about to be pushed out of my own home. 'Cause they had no idea who they were messing with. I barely had time to process my father's death before Linda and Rachel started making their moves, acting like I was nothing more than an inconvenience in a house that I had lived in my entire life, a house that my father had built from the ground up, a house that had never belonged to them in the first place. I had spent the past few days trying to hold myself together, trying to keep my emotions in check, trying to focus on dealing with my loss rather than the two vultures circling around me, waiting for their chance to sink their claws into whatever they could get their hands on. But it was becoming painfully obvious that they weren't going to wait, weren't going to give me even a moment to grieve, weren't going to pretend that their intentions were anything other than completely self-serving. I woke up early that morning, still exhausted, still feeling the weight of my father's absence pressing down on me like a boulder, still expecting to hear his voice somewhere in the house before remembering. He was gone, and he wasn't coming back. I was making coffee in the kitchen, staring out the window, trying to clear my thoughts, when I heard the sound of footsteps behind me, deliberate and purposeful, like someone on a mission. I turned around just in time to see Linda walk in, her arms crossed, her lips pressed into a tight, forced smile, the kind that never quite reached her eyes, the kind that let me know immediately that whatever she was about to say wasn't going to be good. "Morning, sweetheart," she said, her tone as fake as ever. Her voice dripping with that insincere sweetness she always used when she was trying to act like she cared. I didn't bother responding, didn't even acknowledge the greeting, just took a slow sip of my coffee and waited for her to get to the point, because I knew there was one. Knew that she hadn't just come down here to make small talk, knew that whatever was about to come out of her mouth was something I wasn't going to like. She sighed, tilting her head slightly, studying me like I was some stubborn child refusing to listen to reason. "Eric, we need to talk about the house," she said finally, her voice soft, careful, the way someone speaks when they're about to drop a bomb on you but are hoping to soften the impact. I set my coffee down on the counter, slowly crossing my arms over my chest as I met her gaze head-on, refusing to let her think, even for a second, that I was intimidated. "Yeah," I said, arching an eyebrow. "What about it?" She hesitated for a fraction of a second, just long enough to let me know that even she knew how ridiculous this was, how wrong it was, how transparent her motives were. But then she straightened, forcing a smile, forcing that same condescending, patronizing expression she always wore when she was trying to act like she was in control of a situation. "Well," she said, exhaling dramatically, "Rachel and I have been talking, and we just think that, given everything that's happened, it would be best if you—" Before she could finish, before she could even get the words out, Rachel came strolling into the kitchen like she owned the place, flipping her hair over one shoulder, rolling her eyes like she was already bored of this conversation, like the outcome had already been decided, like I was just some obstacle she needed to clear out of her way. "You need to move out," Rachel said bluntly, cutting right through whatever careful, rehearsed speech Linda had been about to deliver. "This house is ours now." I blinked, completely taken aback by the sheer audacity, by the absolute nerve of this girl standing in front of me, this girl who had never contributed a dime to this house, this girl who had spent years treating my father like a walking atom, this girl who had the gall to look me in the eye and tell me, in my own kitchen, that I needed to leave. I let out a slow breath, forcing myself to stay calm, forcing myself not to react immediately, forcing myself to process what they had just said before I responded, because part of me still couldn't believe it, still couldn't wrap my head around the sheer entitlement radiating off of them. "Excuse me," I said finally, my voice low, steady, carefully controlled. Linda let out another sigh, placing a hand on Rachel's shoulder as if to calm her down, as if she was about to pretend to be the reasonable one here, as if she wasn't standing right next to her daughter, backing her up in this absolute insanity. "Eric," she said gently, her eyes full of forced sympathy. "I know this is hard for you, I do, but the reality is, things are different now. Your father is gone and Rachel and I. Well, we need to think about our future. And this house." She paused, giving me a look that almost seemed pitying, like she was about to deliver bad news rather than try to steal the only home I had ever known. "This house was meant to be ours." I stared at her, my mind racing, my blood boiling, my patience snapping in half as I pushed off the counter, taking a slow step forward, making sure they both knew that I wasn't playing this game, that I wasn't about to let them bully me out of my own damn home. "This house was my father's," I said, my voice low, sharp, each word like a blade cutting through the sickly sweet lies she was trying to feed me. "And as far as I know, he never once said that you were supposed to have it, so unless you can show me something, a will, a legal document, anything, that says I don't belong here, I'm not going anywhere." Rachel scoffed, rolling her eyes again, like this was just so exhausting for her. "Ugh, why are you being so difficult?" she groaned. "The will is just a formality, okay? It's obvious that Mom is the one who should get everything since she was married to Dad. It's just how things work." I clenched my jaw so hard I thought my teeth might crack, my entire body vibrating with the effort it took to keep my hands at my sides, to keep my voice even, to keep myself from completely losing it. "Fine," I said, nodding slowly, exhaling sharply. "Then show me the will." Linda hesitated. Rachel's smirk faltered. And in that moment I knew. They didn't have it. I let the silence stretch between us, let them sit in it, let them feel the weight of the fact that their little plan had just hit a wall. But before I could say another word, before I could demand answers, before I could rip them apart for even thinking they could pull this off, there was a knock at the door. I turned, frowning slightly, my stomach twisting with something that felt dangerously close to dread as I made my way to the entrance, pulling it open without thinking. A man stood there, holding a folder in his hands. His expression blank, professional, detached. "Eric?" he asked, glancing down at the papers before looking back up at me. "Yeah," I said warily. He extended the folder, his lips pressing into a thin line. "You've been served," he said simply. I took the papers with stiff fingers, my heart pounding as I flipped them open, my eyes scanning the words, my blood running cold as I processed what I was looking at. Linda wasn't just telling me to leave. She was legally trying to evict me from my own home. I stood in the doorway for what felt like forever, staring down at the eviction papers in my hands, my mind racing through every possible scenario, every possible angle, every possible way this could have happened. My father had never once suggested that he planned to leave the house to Linda or Rachel, never even hinted that I would be anything less than the rightful owner when the time came. He had always been clear about the fact that this house was mine, that it was meant to stay in the family, that he had built it with the intention of passing it down. And yet, here I was, holding legal documents that said otherwise, documents that claimed that I, his own son, was nothing more than a tenant overstaying my welcome. I slammed the door shut without another word, ignoring the way Linda and Rachel were still standing in the kitchen, pretending they hadn't just tried to pull the rug out from under me, acting like they had already won. I needed answers, needed to understand what the hell was going on, needed to see proof that this was anything more than a pathetic last-ditch attempt to get rid of me. My father's lawyer, Mr. Hughes, had always been a fair, straightforward man, someone I had trusted for years, someone who had handled all of my father's business dealings, someone who would never have let this kind of nonsense happen without a damn good reason. I grabbed my phone, dialing his number with shaking fingers, pacing back and forth as the phone rang, each second stretching out longer than the last, each ring making my stomach twist tighter with unease. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, his voice crackled through the receiver, calm and professional as always. "Eric," Mr. Hughes said, his tone neutral, but carrying just the slightest hint of concern. "I was actually about to call you. We need to talk." I exhaled sharply, gripping the phone tighter. "Yeah, I think we do," I muttered. "Because I just got served eviction papers by Linda." There was a brief pause on the other end, and for a second I thought maybe the call had dropped, but then he let out a slow breath, the kind of breath that told me he had already been expecting this. "Meet me at my office in an hour," he said, his voice firm, leaving no room for argument. "Bring the papers with you." I hung up without another word, shoving my phone into my pocket, my pulse pounding so hard it felt like I could hear it in my ears. I turned to find Linda and Rachel still standing there, still watching me, still waiting for my reaction, still looking so sure that they had the upper hand. Rachel smirked, arms crossed over her chest, looking entirely too pleased with herself. "You might as well start packing now," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Wouldn't want to be scrambling at the last minute." I stared at her for a long moment, taking in every inch of her smug, entitled expression, taking in the way she really believed that this was her house now, that she had already won, that I was just an obstacle that needed to be cleared out of the way. Then, slowly, deliberately, I let out a quiet laugh, shaking my head. "You have no idea what you've just started," I said simply, turning on my heel and walking out the door without another word. By the time I got to Mr. Hughes' office, my mind was already spinning with worst-case scenarios, with possibilities I hadn't even considered before, with a terrifying thought that maybe, just maybe, Linda and Rachel had actually found a way to twist things in their favor. I sat across from him in the quiet office, the weight of the past few days settling into my bones as I slid the eviction papers across the desk. Mr. Hughes adjusted his glasses, scanning the documents with a practiced eye, his brow furrowing slightly as he flipped through the pages. "I had a feeling something like this was coming," he murmured, more to himself than to me. I leaned forward, gripping the arms of the chair so tightly my knuckles ached. "What the hell is going on?" I demanded. "How is she even able to do this? I thought my father made it clear that the house was mine." Mr. Hughes sighed, setting the papers down before folding his hands together on the desk. "He did," he said carefully, watching me closely. "But there's a problem." My stomach dropped. "What kind of problem?" He reached into a drawer, pulling out a folder, flipping it open to reveal two nearly identical documents. "I received a copy of your father's will the day after he passed," he explained, sliding one of the papers toward me. "This is the original, the one he finalized months before his death. In this version, everything, his assets, his accounts, and most importantly the house, is left to you." I barely had time to feel relieved before he slid the second document next to the first, tapping his finger against the signature at the bottom. "And this," he said grimly, "is the will that Linda submitted to the courts." I felt my entire body go cold, my fingers trembling as I stared down at the page, my father's signature staring back at me, my name missing from the list of beneficiaries, my stomach twisting into knots as I tried to process what I was looking at. "What the?" I swallowed hard, shaking my head. "How is that even possible?" Mr. Hughes took off his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Because it's fake," he said bluntly. "And not even a good forgery, but it's enough to cause a legal mess if we don't handle it carefully." I let out a sharp breath, my hands balling into fists. "She forged a will." "Yes," Mr. Hughes confirmed, nodding. "And she had the nerve to submit it, assuming that no one would question it. The problem is, the courts take these things seriously, and right now, this fake document is being treated as legitimate until we can prove otherwise." I felt my entire body tense, felt the fury bubbling just beneath my skin, felt the weight of what this meant. Linda had actually tried to erase me, had actually gone so far as to fake legal documents just to steal what wasn't hers. I exhaled slowly, running a hand over my face before leaning back in the chair, letting the reality of it all settle in. "So what do we do now?" I asked, my voice steady despite the anger burning inside me. Mr. Hughes smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was sharp, calculated, the kind of smile that told me he was ready for this fight. "Now," he said, reaching for his phone, "we go to war." I nodded once, inhaling deeply before pulling out my own phone, scrolling through my contacts until I found the number I hadn't thought I would need, the one I had saved just in case of something like this. I pressed the call button, bringing the phone to my ear, my heart pounding as I waited for the voice on the other end to pick up. "Hey," I said when the call finally connected, my voice cool, controlled, filled with the quiet fury of someone who had just had enough. "I need a lawyer. My own lawyer." I knew from the moment I walked out of Mr. Hughes' office that this was going to get ugly, that Linda and Rachel weren't just going to back down, that they would fight as hard as they could to take what wasn't theirs. The fact that they had already gone so far as to forge legal documents told me exactly what kind of people I was dealing with, told me that they weren't just greedy, they were desperate, and desperate people don't give up easily. But what they hadn't counted on, what they had failed to realize, was that I wasn't going to roll over and let them win. They had spent years treating my father like an ATM, had spent the days after his funeral acting like I was nothing more than an obstacle in their way, and now they had the audacity to try and erase me completely. Well, not a chance in hell. I was done playing nice. When I got back to the house that evening, I half expected to find my things packed up and thrown onto the front lawn, half expected to see the locks changed, half expected to hear Linda's sickly sweet voice telling me that she had already handled everything, and that it was best for all of us to move forward peacefully. But instead, I walked through the front door to find Rachel lounging on the couch in the living room, her feet up on the coffee table, scrolling through her phone like she didn't have a care in the world. She didn't even look up when I entered, didn't even acknowledge my presence, just sighed dramatically like my existence was somehow an inconvenience to her. "Oh, you're still here," she muttered, tapping at her screen. "I thought maybe you'd finally come to your senses and left already." I clenched my jaw, inhaling deeply, forcing myself to stay calm, forcing myself to remind myself that this, her smugness, her entitlement, her complete lack of respect, was exactly what I was fighting against. "Yeah," I said, dropping my keys onto the counter, my voice cold, measured. "I'm still here. And I'm not going anywhere." Rachel let out an exaggerated groan, finally looking up, rolling her eyes as she tossed her phone onto the couch beside her. "Ugh, why are you making this so difficult?" she whined. "Like, do you really think this is going to end well for you? Mom is literally just trying to do what's best for our family, and you're acting like some squatter who refuses to take a hint." I let out a sharp, humorless laugh, shaking my head in disbelief at the sheer audacity of this girl sitting in my father's house, in my home, acting like I was the one who didn't belong. "That's funny," I said, crossing my arms. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you and your mother are the ones trying to steal something that isn't yours." Rachel scoffed, flipping her hair over one shoulder like she was bored, like this conversation was beneath her, like she wasn't actively trying to kick me out of my own damn house. "Whatever," she muttered, pushing herself up from the couch. "You'll see soon enough. Mom already talked to her lawyer, and once the court sees the will, you're done." I felt my blood go ice cold, felt my hands clench into fists, felt the weight of the situation pressing down on me like a vice. I wanted to tell her, wanted to shove the truth in her face, wanted to watch the satisfaction drain from her expression when she realized that the will they had submitted was fake, that they had built their entire case on a lie. But I didn't. Not yet. Because if there was one thing I had learned from dealing with people like Rachel and Linda, it was that they thrived on control, on thinking they had the upper hand, on believing that the world revolved around them. And I wanted to watch the moment they realized they had lost. So instead, I just smiled, slow and deliberate, tilting my head slightly as I met her gaze. "We'll see," I said simply, turning on my heel and heading upstairs to my room, leaving her standing there, fuming, her nails digging into her palms. The next day, I woke up to loud music, to the thumping bass of speakers rattling the walls, to the unmistakable sounds of laughter, shouting, and the clinking of glasses. I groaned, running a hand over my face, already knowing exactly what was happening before I even got out of bed. Rachel. Throwing a party. In my house. I stormed downstairs, stepping into the living room to find at least 30 people packed inside. Drinks in hand, music blasting, people sprawled across furniture that didn't belong to them. My blood boiled as I took it all in, as I spotted Rachel in the center of it all, laughing with her friends like she didn't have a care in the world, like this was just another night of her living her best life in her house. I stalked toward her, shoving past drunk partygoers who barely noticed me, my hands clenched at my sides. "What the hell is this?" I demanded, my voice cutting through the noise like a whip. Rachel turned, raising an eyebrow before smirking, tilting her head like she wasn't actively trying to piss me off. "Oh, relax," she said, waving a dismissive hand. "We're just celebrating, you know? New beginnings, fresh starts, all that good stuff." I took a step closer, lowering my voice so only she could hear me, my entire body shaking with rage. "You're throwing a party in my father's house while you're actively trying to steal it from me?" Rachel rolled her eyes, sipping from the red plastic cup in her hand before flashing me a sickeningly sweet smile. "It's our house now," she corrected, her voice filled with smug satisfaction. "You're just a guest at this point. Might as well get used to it." And that was it. That was the moment I decided I was done. Before she could say another word, before she could gloat any further, before she could revel in her delusions for even one more second, the front door swung open with a bang, silencing the music, silencing the conversations, silencing everything. And there, standing in the doorway, holding a folder in one hand and a steely expression on his face, was my lawyer. The real will, the real legal document, the real proof that I was the rightful owner of this house, was in his hands. I turned back to Rachel, watching as the color drained from her face, watching as the realization finally began to set in. "Party's over," I said, smiling for the first time in days. The silence that followed my lawyer's entrance was the most satisfying sound I had heard in weeks, a thick, heavy tension settling over the room as every drunk partygoer suddenly realized that something had shifted, that this wasn't just some fun night at Rachel's place, that something much bigger was happening. The music was still playing in the background, the bass thumping through the walls, but nobody was dancing anymore. Nobody was laughing. Nobody was clinking their glasses together like this was just another casual get-together. No, now everyone was watching, everyone was waiting. Everyone was realizing that they had just walked straight into the middle of something they didn't understand. Rachel's grip tightened around the plastic cup in her hand, her knuckles turning white, her expression twisting into something ugly, something that flickered between anger and panic, something that told me that, finally, she understood that her little game was coming to an end. "What the hell is this?" she demanded, her voice sharp, defensive, but laced with something else, fear. My lawyer, Mr. Calloway, didn't even blink as he stepped further into the house, flipping open the folder in his hands, pulling out a thick stack of neatly organized papers. His voice calm, collected, completely unfazed by the chaos around him. "This," he said, holding up the document at the very top, "is the real will of the late Robert Harrison, legally notarized, signed, and recorded with the appropriate authorities." I turned to Rachel, watching as her expression shifted, watching as her breath caught in her throat, watching as the smugness she had been so sure of just minutes ago completely evaporated. "Go on," I said, crossing my arms over my chest, my voice cool, measured, filled with something dangerously close to amusement. "Tell me again how this house is yours." Before she could respond, before she could scramble for another excuse, before she could lie her way out the way she always had, there was a loud clack of heels against the hardwood floor, and suddenly Linda was there, pushing her way through the crowd, her face stretched into a tight, forced smile, her eyes flashing with barely contained fury. "Now, hold on just a minute," she said, her voice sickly sweet, her tone dripping with that same manipulative charm she had always used when trying to talk her way out of trouble. "I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. You see, the will we have." "The will you have," Mr. Calloway interrupted smoothly, barely sparing her a glance as he flipped through the papers, "is a fraudulent document, one that was submitted under false pretenses in an attempt to steal the legal assets of the deceased. And, as I'm sure you're both well aware, forgery is a felony offense punishable by prison time." The entire room went deathly silent. Rachel's eyes widened, her lips parting slightly as the words prison time settled in, as she finally grasped the weight of what was happening, as she realized that this wasn't just a family dispute anymore, that this wasn't just some petty inheritance battle, that this was something much, much bigger. Linda, to her credit, didn't break so easily. She let out a light, airy laugh, shaking her head like this was all some silly mistake, like she wasn't standing in the middle of a crime scene of her own making. "Oh, come on," she scoffed, waving a hand dismissively. "Let's not be dramatic, all right? There must have been some kind of mix-up, some kind of clerical error." "Is that the argument you'd like to go with?" Mr. Calloway asked, finally looking up at her. His expression unreadable. His voice steady, calm, but carrying an undeniable edge. "Because I can assure you, Mrs. Harrison, the courts take forgery very seriously. And given that we have multiple pieces of evidence proving that your version of the will was altered after Mr. Harrison's passing, I don't think a clerical error is going to hold up very well in front of a judge." Linda opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again, but this time no words came out. Rachel, however, was still trying. "This is bullshit," she snapped, her face red now, her hands clenched into fists, her voice rising higher, more desperate. "You can't just walk in here and say that we forged something. That's not proof. That's just..." Before she could finish her sentence, Mr. Calloway pulled out another sheet of paper and placed it on the coffee table in front of her, tapping it once with his finger. "This is a forensic analysis report of both wills," he said simply, watching her reaction. "Your document has inconsistencies in the ink, meaning it was altered after the original signature was placed. Not to mention, we have multiple witnesses, including Mr. Hughes, who can testify to the real will's legitimacy." Rachel's mouth snapped shut. For the first time since this entire mess started, I watched as the realization fully hit her, watched as she truly understood that there was no way out of this, that she couldn't talk her way out, that she couldn't charm her way out, that this time, she had lost. But the real moment of victory came when Linda's phone rang. She pulled it out with shaky hands, glancing at the screen, her face draining of color the moment she saw the name flashing at the top. I didn't even have to ask. Already knew. It was her lawyer. And the second she answered, the second she put the phone to her ear, The second I heard the frantic, panicked voice on the other end telling her that they were withdrawing from her case, I knew that the battle was over before it had even begun. Her lawyer had abandoned her. Because they had realized, just like everyone else in this room, that she and Rachel had just committed a felony. And then, as if fate itself wanted to deliver the final nail in the coffin, there was a loud knock at the front door, firm and deliberate, the unmistakable sound of authority, the kind of knock that made your stomach drop, the kind of knock that told you that your world was about to change forever. Linda's head snapped up, her eyes darting toward the entrance, her breath catching in her throat. Rachel's face twisted in horror. I turned toward the door, exhaling slowly, my lips curling into a smirk as I took a step forward, as I watched Linda finally understand that there was no getting out of this, no running, no hiding, no last-minute excuse that could save her now. I reached for the doorknob, my heart pounding, my pulse thrumming with satisfaction as I pulled it open, and came face to face with two uniformed officers. "Eric Harrison," one of them asked, his tone clipped, professional. "That's me," I said, crossing my arms over my chest. "We have some questions for Linda Harrison and Rachel Harrison," the officer continued, glancing past me toward the very guilty-looking women standing in the middle of the living room. "Regarding a case of document forgery and fraud." I stepped aside, gesturing toward them with a slow, satisfied smile. "Be my guest," I said. I should have known that Linda and Rachel wouldn't go down without trying to take me with them, should have expected that they'd try to claw their way out of the mess they had created, should have realized that people like them, entitled, manipulative, desperate, don't just accept defeat. The moment the cops walked into my house, I saw the way Linda's brain started working, saw the gears turning, saw the moment she realized that the truth was catching up to her and that she had no way out. And if there's one thing I had learned from dealing with her and Rachel for years, it was that they weren't the type to go down quietly. They were the type to burn everything to the ground if it meant they didn't have to take responsibility. After the police questioned them and took the evidence, after Rachel's party guests awkwardly slipped out one by one, after my lawyer calmly explained to the officers that Linda and Rachel had forged legal documents, I thought that would be the end of it. Thought that they would finally understand that they had lost, that there was no coming back from this, that they had pushed too far. But I underestimated them, underestimated just how far they were willing to go to destroy me, underestimated just how much they refused to believe that they could lose. I found out the hard way. The next morning I woke up to the sound of aggressive knocking at my door, the kind of knocking that makes your stomach drop, the kind of knocking that immediately tells you that something is wrong. My heart was already racing by the time I got out of bed, already pounding as I hurried down the stairs, already thrumming with the uneasy feeling that this wasn't over. I pulled the door open, and my entire body went stiff at the sight of the same two police officers from the night before standing on my porch, their expressions unreadable, their hands resting near their holsters. "Mr. Harrison," one of them said. His voice clipped and professional. "We need to ask you some questions regarding a reported theft on this property." I blinked, my breath catching in my throat, my fingers tightening around the doorknob as I forced myself to stay calm, forced myself to process what they had just said. "Excuse me?" I asked, my voice low, steady, but laced with something dangerous beneath the surface. "Theft." The second officer sighed, flipping open a notepad, his eyes scanning the page before glancing back up at me. "We received a call from Linda Harrison early this morning," he explained. "She claims that several valuable items have gone missing from the house and that you're the prime suspect." I let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking my head, barely able to believe what I was hearing, barely able to comprehend the sheer audacity of what Linda was trying to pull. "Are you serious?" I asked, exhaling sharply, running a hand down my face. "They tried to steal my house, they forged legal documents, they threw a party in my home while actively trying to evict me, and now they're claiming that I stole something?" The officers exchanged a look, and I could tell that even they weren't entirely convinced by whatever ridiculous story Linda had fed them, but protocol was protocol, and they had to follow through. "We just need to ask you a few questions," the first officer said. His tone careful, measured, like he was trying to gauge my reaction, like he was waiting to see if I'd snap. "Would you mind if we took a look inside?" I took a deep breath, exhaling slowly, forcing myself to stay calm, forcing myself to remind myself that I had nothing to hide, that this was just another one of Linda's pathetic attempts to get rid of me. "Fine," I said, stepping aside, gesturing for them to come in. "Search whatever you want. You're not going to find anything." And I meant that. Because I knew I hadn't stolen a damn thing. But Linda knew that too. And that's why she had planted the evidence. It didn't take long for them to find what they were looking for. One of the officers moved toward the living room, scanning the area. His gaze sharp and assessing, before his eyes landed on something near the staircase. A small, expensive-looking jewelry box sitting on the floor, the lid slightly open, the glint of gold catching the light. I frowned, my stomach twisting into knots as I watched the officer crouch down, pick up the box and glance inside. "What's this?" he asked, holding it up. I shook my head, barely able to process what I was seeing, barely able to understand how far they were willing to go. "I have no idea," I said honestly, taking a step forward, my pulse pounding in my ears. "That wasn't there before." The second officer approached, glancing inside the box, before exchanging a knowing look with his partner. "According to Ms. Harrison," he said, flipping through his notes, "this was part of a collection of stolen heirlooms that went missing after last night's incident. She claims they were in her room and now." He gestured toward the floor. "They're here." I stared at them for a long moment, my blood running cold, my breath coming out in sharp, controlled exhales, my fingers curling into fists at my sides. They had set me up. They had actually gone into their room, grabbed some of their own expensive things, and planted them in the middle of my house, thinking that the police would just blindly accept their story, thinking that I wouldn't be able to prove what they had done, thinking that they still had one last chance to take me down. But they hadn't counted on one thing. Had a lawyer. And he was already 3 steps ahead of them. Before I could even open my mouth, before I could even try to explain, before the officers could say another word, there was a sharp knock at the front door, and I already knew who it was. I turned, swinging the door open, and there stood Mr. Calloway. His expression cool, unimpressed. His posture relaxed in that effortless way that only came from someone who had seen it all before. "Ah," he said smoothly, stepping inside without hesitation. "I see Linda and Rachel have escalated things." The officers straightened, their expressions shifting slightly, recognizing him immediately. "Mr. Calloway," one of them said with a nod. "We were just investigating an obvious frame job." Calloway interrupted, arching an eyebrow. "Because that's exactly what this is." He turned to me, nodding once. "Don't say another word," he said calmly before turning back to the officers. "I assume you were called here based on Linda's accusations." The first officer hesitated, shifting slightly. "Well, because I have security footage," Calloway continued, reaching into his briefcase, pulling out a neatly labeled USB drive. "Footage that shows Linda and Rachel placing that jewelry box there not even an hour before you arrived." The officers froze. Linda and Rachel, who had just walked into the living room, visibly paled. I exhaled slowly, watching as their last desperate plan completely crumbled before their eyes. Mr. Calloway smiled, slow and deliberate, handing over the footage. "I think we're done here." And just like that, the officers turned toward Linda and Rachel, because they were now the suspects. And as I watched their faces twist with horror, I knew they had officially lost. And now, they were homeless. I stood at the top of the staircase, arms crossed, watching as Linda and Rachel frantically packed their things, their movements jerky and uncoordinated, their breathing uneven, their entire world collapsing around them in real time. It was a sight I had once thought impossible, a moment I had never dared to imagine, because for years, these two women had moved through life untouched by consequences, shielded by their arrogance, protected by the belief that they could manipulate their way out of anything. But there was no escaping this, no twisting the narrative, no fake tears or empty apologies that would undo what had already been done. They had lost, and they knew it. Linda's hands were shaking as she stuffed clothes into a suitcase, her usual polished exterior cracking piece by piece, her hair disheveled, her eyes wide with the kind of panic that only came from realizing there was no way out. "Eric, sweetheart," she started, her voice high-pitched, frantic, lacking the careful control she usually maintained. "I know things got a little out of hand, but you don't really want to do this, do you?" She let out a nervous laugh, throwing a quick glance at Rachel, who was furiously typing on her phone, probably sending desperate messages to whatever rich friend she had left, hoping that someone would take her in. "I mean, we're family after all. We don't have to let things end this way." I let out a slow breath, tapping my fingers against my bicep, pretending to consider her words, pretending that I was actually weighing the possibility of letting her and Rachel walk away without consequence. But the truth was, I had already made my decision, had made it the moment they forged my father's will, the moment they threw a party in my house, the moment they tried to frame me for theft just to get rid of me. There was no sympathy left in me, no guilt, no second-guessing, because I had spent too many years being pushed aside, too many years watching them take while pretending I didn't exist. You really want to play the family card now? I asked, my voice calm, measured, devoid of emotion. Because I don't remember you thinking about family when you were trying to steal my house. Linda swallowed hard, forcing another smile, but it wobbled, barely holding together. It was never about stealing, she insisted, her tone almost pleading now. It was just about making sure Rachel and I had security. You have to understand, Eric, after your father passed, we didn't know what to do, we were grieving, we were. I held up a hand, cutting her off. Stop, I said sharply. Just stop. You forged legal documents. You tried to have me evicted from my own house. You tried to have me arrested for a crime I didn't commit. And now, after everything, you want me to feel bad for you. I let out a quiet laugh, shaking my head. You made your choices, Linda. Now you get to live with them. Rachel let out a loud, frustrated groan, finally looking up from her phone, her face twisted in disbelief, her fingers tightening around the device like she wanted to throw it. Ugh, this is so unfair, she snapped, flipping her hair over her shoulder. Do you have any idea what you're doing? Do you even realize how bad this makes you look? People talk, Eric. You think you can just kick us out and everything will go back to normal? You think nobody's going to see you as the villain in all this? I arched an eyebrow, unimpressed. I think the only people who see me as a villain are the ones losing right now, I said, shrugging. And honestly, I don't care. Rachel let out another scoff, shaking her head furiously as she went back to her phone, tapping aggressively. I'm not worried, she muttered, more to herself than to me. I'll be fine. I have options. She just didn't know it yet. 'Cause I had made sure of that. For years, Rachel had built her entire social life around money, had surrounded herself with people who only cared about wealth and status, had created a world where she never had to worry about consequences, because as long as she had expensive clothes, a nice car, and a high enough bank balance, she belonged. But money doesn't just disappear without people noticing, and once word got out that her family's assets were gone, that she wasn't the rich, untouchable girl she had always pretended to be, those options she was so sure of would start drying up fast. And I had made sure everyone knew. Before Linda and Rachel had even started packing, before they had even realized just how deep their problems ran, I had made a few calls, sent a few emails, had made sure that every single person in their social circle knew exactly what had happened, knew exactly how they had tried to steal from me, knew exactly how low they had sunk. By the time Rachel started reaching out for help, the damage was already done. The rejections started rolling in within minutes. Her face twisted with frustration as she scrolled through her messages, her fingers gripping the phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. What the hell? She muttered under her breath. Why is nobody answering? I leaned against the railing, tilting my head as I watched her panic unfold. Guess money really does buy friendship, I mused. Rachel turned on me, her face red with fury, her lips pressed into a thin line. You did this, she accused, her voice shaking. You told everyone, didn't you? Smirk. No, Rachel, I said, my voice dripping with amusement. You did this. You just didn't see it coming. Linda, realizing now that her daughter had no backup plan, turned back to me, her hands clasped together, her eyes desperate, her breath coming out in sharp, shallow gasps. Eric, please, she begged, her voice breaking. We have nowhere to go. Can't we at least come to some kind of settlement? Something fair for all of us. I stared at her for a long moment, my expression unreadable, letting her sit in the silence, letting her squirm, letting her feel the weight of her own downfall. Then I smiled. Absolutely not. Linda let out a sharp, choked sob, her shoulders shaking, her entire body slumping as if she had finally accepted that there was nothing left, that she had truly lost everything. I watched as they dragged their suitcases to the door, watched as they took one final look at the house they had tried to steal, watched as the reality of what had happened settled deep into their bones. And then, just as Linda reached for the doorknob, I spoke one last time, my voice calm, cool, final. Oh, and one more thing, I said, smiling wider. They turned, both of them looking at me with exhausted, defeated expressions, their eyes hollow, their shoulders slumped. I took a slow step forward, meeting their gazes head-on. I just bought the apartment complex across town, I said, shrugging. So if you do find a way to afford rent, you'll still be paying me. Linda's breath caught. Rachel's face drained of color. And with that, I shut the door in their faces. The house was quiet now, the kind of quiet that comes after storm, the kind of quiet that settles deep in your bones and reminds you that something big just ended. For the first time in weeks, there was no shouting, no forced conversations, no condescending remarks, no fake smiles hiding knives beneath them. Linda and Rachel were gone, and I had won. I should have felt nothing but satisfaction, should have let myself revel in the fact that I had taken back what was mine, that they had finally faced consequences for everything they had done, that justice had finally caught up to them. And yet, as I stood in the center of the house that had been at the heart of this entire war, as I looked around at the walls that had once felt like home but had been tainted by their presence for so long, I found myself wondering, did I go too far? The question had been nagging at the back of my mind ever since I shut the door in their faces, ever since I watched their stunned, defeated expressions, ever since I delivered that last, cruel blow about the apartment complex. It had felt good in the moment, had felt like the perfect way to make them understand that they had never had the power they thought they did, that they had never been in control. But now that the dust had settled, now that the fight was over, I couldn't help but hear my father's voice in the back of my head, reminding me of the lessons he had always tried to teach me about fairness, about integrity, about knowing when to walk away from a fight instead of letting it consume me. I had spent years believing that the best way to win was to take the high road, to be the bigger person, to let karma do its work instead of getting my own hands dirty. But that's the thing about karma. It moves too slow sometimes, and people like Linda and Rachel don't learn unless they're forced to. So I had forced them. I had made sure that they lost in every possible way, had made sure that they had nowhere left to turn, had made sure that they felt even an ounce of what they had put me through. And still a small part of me wondered. I walked through the house, running my fingers along the banister of the staircase, remembering all the times my father had stood in this very spot. His voice echoing through the halls, his presence making everything feel safe. He had built this place with his own two hands, had poured his heart and soul into making it a home, and I had spent my entire life believing that one day it would be mine. Not because I demanded it, not because I felt entitled to it, but because my father had wanted it that way. And yet, Linda and Rachel had tried to rip that away from me like I was nothing, like I was temporary, like I was some guest overstaying his welcome in his own family's house. They had looked me in the eye and told me to get out, had tried to rewrite history, had tried to erase me from my father's legacy as if I had never mattered at all. So why the hell should I feel bad for them now? I exhaled slowly, shaking my head, pushing the doubt away, forcing myself to remember every single thing they had done, forcing myself to recall the arrogance, the manipulation, the absolute audacity they had carried through this entire fight. They hadn't cared when I was grieving, hadn't given me a moment to breathe before they started circling like vultures, hadn't hesitated to try every dirty trick in the book just to take something that didn't belong to them. And in the end they had failed. Linda and Rachel were now officially homeless, their reputation in ruins, their future uncertain, and that should have been the end of it. But even after everything, I knew that people like them always found a way to land on their feet, always managed to convince someone else to take pity on them, always had one more trick up their sleeve. But not this time. Because I had made sure that every door was closed, every bridge was burned, every safety net was gone. Rachel had spent her entire life climbing social ladders, surrounding herself with people who only valued status, making sure she was always in the right circles. But the second word got out that she wasn't rich anymore. The second people realized she had nothing to offer, they had dropped her like she was nothing. She had texted everyone, had tried calling, had begged for a place to crash, and every single time she had been ignored. Linda, on the other hand, had spent so long relying on my father's money, on the security of being a rich man's wife, that she had no idea how to function without it. She had never worked a day in her life, had never had to think about bills, had never imagined a world where she wasn't taken care of. And now, she was facing reality for the first time and she had nothing. Was that too harsh? Maybe. But maybe harsh was exactly what they deserved. I walked to the front door, pulling it open, stepping onto the porch, letting the cold night air hit my skin as I stared out at the quiet street. The stars were bright, the world was still, and for the first time since my father died, I finally felt at peace. The war was over. The house was mine, just like it was always supposed to be, just like my father had intended it to be, just like I had fought for it to be. And Linda and Rachel, they were nothing more than a bad memory now. I let out a slow breath, letting the weight of everything lift off my shoulders, letting myself finally believe that it was done. Maybe I had been ruthless. Maybe I had been cold. Maybe I had gone too far. But sometimes the only way to win is to burn everything down and start fresh.